Hey, it's Nikki, and today's episode is a special series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact with my friends from Borshoff. I am a huge fan of the work Borshoff does to advance internal communication, and so happy that they have joined Gut Plus Science for a special series. Get ready for internal communication inspiration. There's so many nuggets of wisdom here.
Hey everyone, welcome to In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact. I'm Katherine Coble, your host, and I'm really excited to bring you this monthly series that explores how you, as a leader, can become a better communicator. Thanks for listening. Let's get started. When things get hard, people look to the leader. And nowhere is this more evident than when a crisis hits an organization. And we as leaders have a duty to our employees to help them sort through and really understand what happened and what it means for them and for the organization. Now today, I'm really excited to share a very special episode of In the Loop with you. It's on how to lead well through crisis. Now it's special to me because I'm joined by one of my favorite people in the world, my business partner and communications counselor extraordinaire, Jennifer Dzwonar. Jen, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me and for that introduction.
Yeah. Well, I thought that we would have an interesting little conversation today about how to lead well through crisis. And you and I have been talking about this for years, how important it is for leaders to lead well when something doesn't go as planned. And communication is really a critical part of that. Before we jump into talking, though, about crisis communications, give us just a little bit of background about you and where you've been on this journey.
Sure. Thank you. So I joined Borshoff 30 years ago. We're just about on the actual anniversary of that. And from the time I came to Borshoff, we actually started working on creating a media training. And since then, we have been honing it, updating it, changing it. And yet I'm struck by this incredible milestone of 30 years, which just seems impossible, that some of the things really still remain true today. There really are some just evergreen concepts in good crisis communications and in good internal crisis communications that we're going to talk about today that were true then and are true now. The ways we communicate have changed. Lots of things have changed about the, obviously, employee engagement and workplace and the types of issues, but some things really remain true. And we work on everything from acute crises. I think a lot of people think of things that happen, bam, as a crisis, but really a lot of them are also slow burn situations as well. And that's especially true with internal.
Yeah, definitely. Now, just to kind of set the stage a little bit, I want to share with everyone what we're really going to focus on today. When it comes to communicating in a crisis, the most important thing that has to happen first and foremost, of course, is moving into some sort of a crisis protocol, communicating for safety. Whenever there's any sort of like a natural disaster, some sort of violence in the workplace maybe, or some other safety issue, communication with employees can actually save lives and needs to happen quickly. And most organizations have some sort of a safety protocol and safety-related communications process in place. What we really want to focus on today is what happens after the immediate danger is over, or when it's a crisis that maybe doesn't involve a safety issue, but it still causes, a lot of questions, maybe some concerns, or even just a need for some sort of a change to happen. Now, when we hear crisis communications, we often think of, television cameras and press statements and how the crisis is impacting the company's external reputation. But you and I have discovered that the internal audiences are sometimes overlooked or maybe at least put second behind the public response to a crisis. Why do you think that is? And should leaders put internal audiences first?
It's a great question because the quick answer is yes, always internal first. We know it is so easy, as you were just saying, to get focused on the media and to get focused on the public because it's where we know that a lot of reputations of organizations appear to be won and lost. However, it is so easy in a crisis to get hyper-focused on the media, potential media, on clients and customers, and to skip right over the internal audiences. And it's a big mistake. At minimum, we recommend that whatever is going out externally as a statement be sent to internal first. So that is one way to, at very minimum, engage your internal, is to make sure that they have the messaging, the statement. This is what we're saying. This is either a release we're putting out. This is a statement we're going to be saying. This is what you can say. Because what happens is that employees, shockingly, are people, and they have social networks, and they have places they need to go and things they talk about. First of all, they talk with each other about whatever's going on. And then secondly, their friends, family connections. So equipping them, even with a very basic statement of here's all we can say about the situation, it may be very minimal at first, is very important. And then we know that internal audiences can be both the best ambassadors and the worst nightmares. That they can just be those people who make everything better, or can make everything far more difficult in a crisis situation. So just making sure that they're there and informed. Another thing to think about with internal is that you and I know the most credibility is somebody on the inside. And so when we might read about a company, we might hear about it in the news, but who has the most credibility is somebody who works there. When we have a friend who works there, we'll say, well, let me tell you what's really going on. And so just knowing that internal audience has that credibility can help leaders understand why they need to prioritize those audiences.
So true. I think it's not an either or, it's a both and when it comes to how we're thinking about the communication and the prioritizing of the audiences. We have to make employees our first priority in many respects, because if we don't, like you said, they're just going to look for other sources to get their information. And in the world we live in today, those sources are abundant, but also those employees can definitely be partners in managing through a crisis and getting through it. So I guess my question to you then is, how do you even start with that? What's the first action that a leader should take to start that communication chain?
Something along the lines of like a holding statement is usually a pretty safe space to start. And a lot of time in crisis plans that we create for people, we actually include a whole list of holding statements that apply to everyone. You can find these online by looking at them, but there are things like, we're looking into the situation and we'll let you know when we know more. We know that such and such an incident occurred and we are investigating. We have heard about X and we are looking into it. The safety of our employees is our top priority. Just kind of depends on what the situation is. There's a whole host of them. But the idea is it is something, and it is never no comment, and it is never talk to the hand. It is truly, here is something you can say, and when we have more, we'll share more. I've been doing this long enough that there used to be this real division of audiences and messages. We used to have messages for this group, messages for this group, and that has totally changed over time. And it is so much more important to have consistent messaging for internal and external. Now, we know internal may get more details because things will make more sense to an internal audience of what's going on, but we recommend that anything you would share with employees would be fine, theoretically, if they posted it. Now, it's also smart to have a social media policy and a media policy that says you should not, as an employee, speak directly to the media, and we ask that you not post about any of this situation. But the reality is, it is things they can say to their partner, to their friends, to whatever it is out in the world, and you would be okay with it. And giving them something, as you said, is so much better than nothing. And holding statements prove that.
Yeah. And so really, I think the first big idea that you're helping us get our arms around is the idea of having a plan and practicing the plan, being prepared ahead of time. Would you agree?
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, it feels like it's really not a matter of if a crisis will happen for most organizations, but when. And again, we're not just talking about, a a fire in a manufacturing plant or a chemical spill. These are things, crises can happen in any business. And a crisis isn't just a huge, sudden, acute event. But when it is, it's not just a matter of clearing the area and talking about what happened. There's a lot of fallout typically that happens after that.
That's exactly right. Wherever humans are, crises can happen. And maybe it's more of an issue rather than a crisis. That word can mean a whole degree of different things. And people who work in places like hospitals are so used to, dealing with issues day in and day out that they have a different spectrum of what an issue is. But people who work at a different kind of organization, they have a smaller spectrum of that. I was just talking with the principal at a tech company just in the last couple of days, and he was saying, I guarantee in our cybersecurity, plans that people do, communications is not a piece of that because there is so much emphasis on and work to be done to just solve a cybersecurity issue. That communications, everybody's just hoping, well, that'll just fall out from this. And that's the part where I think we're getting more and more involved, and a credit to organizations everywhere that everybody is getting far more proactive. As you said, have a plan. Don't assume that everyone will figure out who a spokesperson should be, who those key audiences are, where a holding statement is. There are just so many things you could do in advance and do it when your adrenaline is not high. That makes it 100 times better to plan.
Okay, so kind of to go along with that then, let's talk about getting the timing right, and particularly in addressing employees as well as addressing the outside world. Obviously, if something big and quick happens, as a leader, you're getting calls from the outside world wanting to know, hey, what's going on? But you also have your people inside that want answers as well. So talk a little bit about the timing, and, waiting too long could cause some issues, but doing it too quickly could be a problem as well. What's your thought there?
Absolutely. Timing is a lot of what we can provide some outside counsel on. Sometimes it's also why this is always a team effort. This should never be one individual who just is going to somehow solve your issue. For one thing, the joke is they're always on a cruise when it happens. So if you've ever positioned one person, you've already set yourself up for, not a good situation. But when you have a team, it does take that cross-functional discussion to say, what is the right timing for this? And as you said, let's use a data breach as an example. You are looking to have enough information that you can sound intelligent and you have some sense of the scale, the scope, who might have been affected, how it happened, et cetera. But you haven't waited too long that you infuriate your audiences, especially those affected by it. That, to me, is one of those clearest examples of, as a team, we look at it and say, can we make an intelligent statement about any part of this? We work on some where somebody was a victim of one of those phishing scams. They sent all the W-2s out to something because they thought the CEO requested them. So as soon as you know that, it doesn't mean you have to be fully disclosive to the public, to the media, even to your internal audiences, but you can make some kind of statement of, we are aware of what happened, we are looking into it, we are analyzing the scope of this, and we'll have more information. And even that is helpful, that you have to get to a certain point, but you can't wait too long on that, because now I need to know that my W-2 is out there and you'll have that information for me. And that's a good example of one too, where you tell your internal, because they're really the most affected. These were W-2 forms. So it's your employees and potentially some different types of employees that would have been affected. But you need a public statement, because all it takes is one disgruntled employee to then, tell somebody externally or say, can you believe this? And you're going to need an external, but it's going to be tight. It's not going to be detailed. And here's another important point, and it could go on a data breach. I could talk about this all day long. Is really important that your company was the victim. I know you're feeling super guilty, and especially the person who actually clicked on that is feeling like the perpetrator, but they are not. The perpetrator is the bad person out there who put this thing in the universe and who happened to have preyed on you. Keeping that in mind is a really important reputation management piece of it. Doesn't mean people aren't mad, doesn't mean you don't have to clean up a mess. It's still your responsibility, but you are not the perpetrator. You are the victim, and that's important. So timing plus that positioning is really done better by a group of informed people who helped put together a plan and now have to work the plan.
Yeah, definitely. So that gets to the idea of tone. And I want to come back to that in just a moment, because first, I'd really like to talk a little bit more about this idea of timing as it relates to maybe more of a slow burn situation, right? We've so far been really focused on things that, something acute happens right in the moment. There's a data breach, there's a accident in a manufacturing plant, whatever it might be. What about those times when maybe it's not a crisis in the traditional sense? It's more of a slow burn, like there's a chronic just issue, a little, irritation that's been going on that's starting to come to a little bit of a boil. It might be, some sort of a financial situation or something like that. Does that change how you think about the timing of talking to your internal audiences versus your external audiences?
Yes, it's a great question, because a lot of the most challenging and damaging issues are the slow ones, the ones that take a really long time. I'll use an example of higher education because their timelines are just a lot slower than a lot of the world. And it's not anybody's fault. It's really just the way they're equipped. So in other words, when you're going through financial challenges, as so many higher education institutions are right now, they need to give, by nature of their faculty agreements, a full year's notice for anybody who's going to potentially, lose their position, eliminate a program, a full year. Well, you can imagine, you don't wait until the year anniversary. You're actually talking about it a few months even before that, and you're having to give warnings before that, literally a warn notice, but then also times when it's just good communication practice to start planting those seeds. One of course, can you raise additional revenue? Can you find different profit centers? Things like that. But then also, how do we, just let people know there are challenges and big changes are going to come? That timing is a constant conversation among very intelligent people. And no matter what you do, you will be criticized. That's the other thing, because those are just such miserable situations. No college or university wants to eliminate anything. They only want to add, just as businesses do. And so when you know that that's coming, that slow really takes a full strategic plan for just the communications that says, when we have these milestones, here's what we're obligated to say. And then here's what we also want to say. And when we see it done well, it's a lot of in-person communication for one thing. It's getting groups together and talking in person with that faculty, with that staff. It could be by a department. It could be broader than that, but it can also be very one-on-one. Just that idea of almost like office hours, but having one-on-one communication, either for that person's, personal situation and how we could get them to a better place, but also so they understand, how all of this came to be. Won't solve all the issues, but it definitely is, as you're saying, that timing of the slow burn just leads to more robust planning is needed and really good communicators. And keeping everybody on message is challenging because we have to keep up with, here is what we can say about this situation. Here is when we will know more. Here is how decisions will be made. And a lot of times those slow ones are feeling like there's not new information coming out because things take a really long time. So just keeping up with, here's where we are in a process and making sure that that's posted and available is really helpful.
Yeah. And it also gets to this idea, I don't know if you've heard this term recently, but I think it's kind of an interesting way to think about it. It's called mixternal communications, a mixing of the internal and the external. And when it comes to messaging, I would think that the days are kind of over when you would develop completely different messaging tracks for internal versus external audiences, especially given kind of our connected world and social media and that kind of thing. You have to probably make some assumptions when it comes to your not only your timing, but also the messaging itself, would you say?
Absolutely. Was not familiar with the term, but now I want to use it. I want to say mixternal because that is so true. It is really one. And I think what the term does, which is interesting, is it kind of forces you to remember like this is going to have both an internal and external. As we're thinking about higher education or anybody, even, K-12 or something else, anyone who works with, throw students into the mix and you have a whole nother level of audience. But talk about fast moving. They will have it posted within seconds, where older generation, they take a little bit to actually get something out to their friends or online or to share it. But literally it happens. We've sat there, the students are Facebook Live for an announcement. It's immediately on. And so that organization has to be super ready with a statement, even if there's not a lot they can say, because mixternal is reality.
It's for sure. Definitely. Okay. So one last area we kind of touched on earlier, and I want to go back to is the idea of the tone that a leader takes when communicating. And that gets a little bit further into this messaging idea. And, Edelman, a global PR firm, puts out an annual study that they do. It's called the Trust Barometer. And their findings have shown over the last several years that trust has really just taken a beating. We can see it in the world we live in today. People don't trust the media. People don't trust corporations. People don't trust government. Trust in our major institutions is just going down, down, down. Now, what is interesting, though, is that where people do say that they have trust is really in two groups of people. The first being technical and what they would call scientific experts. So if someone who has that kind of a background is sharing information, they're more likely to believe that than if it's just, someone from the government, generally speaking, let's say. Or the other group of people being what they call, quote, people like me. And I thought this is really fascinating. And as someone who's really focused on internal communications and employee engagement, that really struck a chord with me. I think that, you said it earlier, actually, employees are often seen as those people who are like me. And if something's going on in a company, they're the ones that are the most likely to really understand and to know. So if they're talking about that issue, I'm probably listening to what they have to say. Would you agree?
I agree. It's also interesting, your trust. You're right. It's become a really cynical world. I'm fascinated by sociological studies and communication studies, of course, on things like this, like the one you mentioned, which I was less familiar. And I know Edelman, and they do that great trust barometer. We also use an Adfontis, media scoping of how much you can trust different media. And I'm always struck by people will say, I don't trust the media, but I trust my media. And I don't trust schools, but I trust my kid's school. And I don't trust religion, but I trust my church. And I don't trust that. But and proximity is a whole separate, issue we could talk about. But when you're proximate to an issue, it builds sympathy, it builds empathy, and it builds trust, which is right back to that communications piece of why in-person, one-to-one communication is more credible. It's why the more proximate we could get to an issue. And it's why, as you're saying, I trust people like me because that feels proximate. And I trust an employee who works at that company because they know. Some of the issues that we deal with, we were just talking about this yesterday with a larger company, is that there are different groups of employees. And so you will have who are of the people, and who's that group. And there will be people who sit more proximate to a leader who trust that person more. Not always the case. We know there's obviously cynicism and issues all over the place. But if top leaders are good communicators, the people who get closer to that tend to trust them more. The people who sit farther out have less reason to trust them. Sometimes we start stereotyping both the leaders and we stereotype the people farther from them. in certain ways that is really not fair, that communications can help bridge. If we could get those people together more often too, not just when there's a crisis. That's the other thing, is if you only see your leader when there's a problem, that becomes your context too. But if you're more regularly doing online meetings, if your people, have an online possibility, getting together in person, if you're small enough, obviously individual coffees, but if you could do town halls, if you can do these things where you keep people together, some people roll their eyes about those. Let's say, I don't have time for this, either at the leader or the participant level. But when you take time to do those or put out, if it's a reading situation, put out newsletters and updates, that all you're doing is building trust. And you're building trust for when you're most going to need it, which is in a crisis. So that's when your tone, your plan, and all of that comes together. And internal communications can be what saves the day for a company's reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. You got to think of trust as something that you put in a bank, right? And you may not need it directly every day on a day-to-day basis. You do, but you may not really think about it. It's kind of a given until something gets hard. And then people are really needing to trust what you're saying. And if you haven't done the work to build trust over time, you're not going to just suddenly have it. So I love that. I think that's so important for leaders to be thinking about. Okay, so it's not something that can be built overnight. What have you seen work well or maybe not so well when it comes to trust? And really, this kind of brings up another key word we hear a lot about today, which is culture.
I've seen more leaders who are better communicators over time. I think people naturally now are rising through ranks by being better communicators. And I think it's easy for us to forget that wasn't necessarily true decades ago. You could really rise by being good at a lot of other things and not communicating with people. And now I think there's more and more emphasis. I think there's more executive coaches in the world. There are more ways and leadership seminars and this and that can give you those skills if you don't have them. I've also seen leadership teams build better communications where if one person is better one-on-one, have somebody else who's great in that big group setting. If somebody else is a really authentic and great leader, but somebody else is great at being that more external, spokesperson kind of thing. Those are different communication skills that all help in a crisis, and they all help toward building what you're saying, that communications and culture. Most places that have those really high scores on best places to work and, places that get known for having a good culture is information sharing and culture building through communications. I mean, I know it's the lens that, you and we look at everything. It's like, of course it is. But the truth is, I think we do think that communications is like the answer to everything in the whole wide world, including world peace or whatever we're going to get to, But I think if we think of that on your more micro scale of any organization, it doesn't mean you inundate people because nobody has time for that, either at the leadership or the, work level for that. But the fact is that better cadence of communication, talking more often. We even see with crisis planning, more people are doing proactive plans way in advance, have a plan, revisit it annually. And then, interestingly, I think this has been a new chapter. Tell your employees that you have this plan. It used to just be that just, sits in a binder and now it sits on somebody's computer. But actually telling people we have a plan for this. We've talked about it. And by the way, no matter how many scenarios you do, you will never have enough scenarios for reality of what's going to actually happen. But we right now in most plans, we have 3 to 5 scenarios. And then they'll fall into different categories and different vulnerabilities within that company. But what that does is it gives some thought process, and then you can share that with employees. Not everyone will be interested, but some people, you're just trying to give them reassurance. And again, build culture that says, you work for a company that is thinking these things through, and we will have a plan, get outside help as needed, or whatever the case may be, that we are prepared and we will be prepared and we will keep you in the loop when the time Oh, in the loop. I just used that as a pun. I just named you. Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, what gives you in the loop, even in the time, of a crisis? And, you could just sort of sleep better at night knowing that somebody in your organization is thinking that way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has just really been a great discussion. And I think leaders can take several things away from this that they could potentially put into place right away. But I just want to kind of do a little bit of a wrap up here. So, one of the big things is, of course, have a plan, practice the plan, anticipate and plan for those crises that your organization could potentially face before they happen. And have got to be at least 3, 4, 5, 10. But just spending a little bit of time ahead of time, thinking that through and preparing and putting some things down on paper, online, whatever it might be, would certainly do any leader well. Number 2, think about timing. You've got to act fast, but you only say what you know to be true. Speed really is important, but it shouldn't come at the price of accuracy. So it's better to do some acknowledgement, even if you don't have a lot of information, and then continue to follow that up with more detail as you have it available. And then really third is this idea of getting the tone right. You certainly want to be consistent in your messaging. You got to be honest and communicate. And then really the way that you would want to be communicated with if you were in that situation, and just be authentic. I think employees will really latch onto that, and it will help to build trust in the organization. So as we wrap up today, I just want to encourage those leaders who are out there and listening to us. Leadership is definitely hard, but you really don't have to do it alone. Think about who can be your partner, who can help you stay accountable and focus on the people in your organization. When you keep employees in the loop, they become your partner and they can help you manage through a crisis and really come out on the other side. Thanks for listening.
We just left the world a little bit better. Now, go do something with it.